and thanks to Nasser and all the organizers for including the Kauffman Foundation in this. I assume that a lot of you are not familiar with Kauffman, so in addition to what Martin said, I'll just add that our two focus areas are entrepreneurship and education. And in our entrepreneurship work, we try to do as much as we can to support not only entrepreneurs directly, although we can't give money directly to startups, but we support a lot of entrepreneurship support organizations. We've supported organizations in Buffalo, in Syracuse, and in other parts of New York and throughout the country. And then as Martin mentioned, we try to do a lot of research and policy engagement to improve the environment, to improve the landscape in which startups and in which entrepreneurs operate and can compete. And we were started by Ewing Kauffman. Mr. Kauffman was a pharmaceutical entrepreneur. He started a pharmaceutical company in his basement in the 1950s. He was grinding down oyster shells into calcium supplements in his basement was his very first product. This was way before, clearly, rigorous FDA regulation. And the way he got started was he had served in the Navy, and when he came back to Kansas City, he grew up in a rural area just outside Kansas City, he found a job as a salesman selling to physicians. And in his first year as a salesman for the company, he was so good that he out-earned the president of the company selling on commission. And so they rewarded him by cutting his territory, because clearly no salesman could make more than the president of the company. So in his second year as a salesman, he went out and did it again. He again out-earned the president, even though he had a smaller territory selling on commission. And they again cut his territory to punish him for out-earning the president. So he decided then and there he would never work for anyone again, and that's when he went to his basement and started grinding up oyster shells. And his company, Marion Labs, eventually became a multinational, billion-dollar company. No longer exists anymore, went through a series of M&A in the 80s and 90s. But toward the end of his life, in the late 80s and the early 90s, Mr. Kauffman, like a lot of American entrepreneurs, decided he wanted to put his money that he had earned through entrepreneurship into philanthropy. But unlike a lot of entrepreneurs turned philanthropists, he decided that he wanted his money to support more entrepreneurs. And he called himself a common man who did an uncommon thing, growing a company from his basement into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. So he wanted to make that uncommon thing more common across the U.S. And that's one of the reasons we exist, and it's one of the reasons we do what we do today. I was asked to talk about some of our work in research and policy, to talk about kind of the aggregate state of entrepreneurship in upstate New York, and then talk about what upstate New York and your communities might learn from some other places around the U.S. that have had some entrepreneurial success. I can only talk from the research and data that we do and that we support. All of you know things on the ground a lot better than I do. The incubators, the accelerators, the activity, the things in like gaming and esports that Brian talked about. You know that a lot better than I do. And so part of the reason I'm here also is to learn from you as to what's going on in the upstate and how Kauffman can do a better job of supporting not just your communities and your programs, but others like you across the country. So you'll probably take issue with some of the stuff I say about upstate, but it's only because I'm talking about it through the work we support. So I want to learn more from you of what's really going on the ground. I thought it was very important what Martin said, just to remind ourselves why we are here. I assume that's because you are here at this conference, you already appreciate the importance of entrepreneurship. But I think it's always worthwhile, especially when we're talking about government and policymakers, both public and private, to remind people of why entrepreneurship matters. And job creation is only one reason, but it's a pretty big reason. Your new companies, your young companies, and your growing companies, which are mostly young, are your main source of job creation. And your larger and older companies, including your older small business companies, not just giant companies, are a tiny portion of new job creation. They employ a lot of people. But in terms of the new jobs that you're getting in your community, it's you. It's the entrepreneurs, it's the companies you work with. And that's true in New York, it's true across the country. It's actually true in most other countries too. There's been a lot of good international research showing that this is not just a US thing, it's actually true across most of the world. nationally across the country, when you look at business creation as a whole, so all companies, tech, non-tech, service companies, everything, we still haven't recovered back to kind of the level of business creation we enjoyed pre-recession. Kind of fell off a cliff 2008, 9, 10, and really hasn't rebounded. We're starting 100,000 fewer businesses per year in the US than we were on average in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. And this trend holds across most of the country. I'll talk about that in a second. There's some encouraging signs, though. Growth entrepreneurship appears to be rebounding earlier than just aggregate business creation. So we may be doing a better job right now on entrepreneurial quality than on quantity, and this could be a leading indicator. Maybe we're creating a lot of good companies, and we're going to see aggregate business creation follow. But this is a really encouraging sign because your growth entrepreneurs are where a huge percentage of your job creation and your innovation comes from. And I know all of you probably know that already. Now, those are aggregate trends. It's highly uneven across the country. Some people estimate that when you look at net business creation just over the last few years, that it's mostly concentrated in just a handful of metropolitan areas. I don't know if that's true, but that's according to some data and estimates. Here on this map, which by the way was created by researchers at SUNY Albany with support from Kauffman, but the darker orange is indicator of more vibrancy, and the light blue and darker blue is less vibrancy or weaker ecosystems. And this entrepreneurial ecosystem atlas, as the SUNY folks call it, takes into account about 12 to 15 different indicators of ecosystem vibrancy. That's a terrific website, so it's really a lot of fun for people who like research to play around with and compare yourself to different communities. But then focusing in on New York, you see that for the most part, at least according to these indicators, most of your upstate communities are underperforming in terms of ecosystem vibrancy. Now again, you know what's going on the ground a lot better than I do, and you can see kind of inside the data, but at least from a data perspective and from these various data points, there's a lot of room for improvement. But I don't think anyone would admit that everything's perfect in upstate or anywhere else. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the indicators that are underneath this. Focusing in on upstate communities, and I know these charts are difficult to read, I'm completely happy to share these slides or any other charts that didn't make it into this presentation. But here you see national startup density. So how many startups are you creating per 100,000 people? And that blue line on each chart is the national startup density, and the 6 lines underneath that are upstate communities. So for every single year since the early 90s, startup density in these 6 upstate areas has been lower than national startup density. You are getting your jobs from those startups. So if your startup density is a lot lower than other communities, you're not getting as much job creation as you could or you should. The blue line in each of those charts are your youngest, your brand new startups. We often think about startups as kind of the riskiest, the most volatile sector. Oh my God, entrepreneurship's so risky. That's your most stable source of job creation. And the red and the orange lines underneath, those are your oldest businesses, both young and small. So you can see that that's actually your most volatile sector in terms of job creation, because they'll create lots of jobs in 1 year. 2 years later, they'll cut them all. So your steadiest source of job creation are actually your startups, even though we think that's often the riskiest sector of the economy. And then I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, but kind of when you tease out urban and rural, there's a divergence in New York. There's been a divergence everywhere. This is not unique to New York. But you can see, especially since the 90s, a very steep downward trend in startup density in rural New York. And again, this pattern holds across the country, across every state. I don't think that's a surprise. So now I want to talk about what upstate communities might learn from other communities. 2 of these are fairly obvious. One, hopefully, is relatively non-obvious. And talk about kind of the stories of these 3 places and what we can learn. But I don't think what we can actually learn from Silicon Valley and Boulder is what's typically kind of offered as lessons from those places. And Brian mentioned, a lot of places want to be the next Silicon Valley, and that's, I'm probably putting words in your mouth, but I think you said that's not a good goal for upstate New York. And I mean, there's so many places across the country, as you know, that have branded themselves Silicon something. There's Silicon Flatirons in Colorado, there's Silicon Prairie out in Kansas City, there's Silicon Bayou in New Orleans, there's Silicon Hills, there's like Silicon everything across the country. There's like 50 of these. And everyone wants to be Silicon Valley, and they all look at Silicon Valley and say, they had venture capital and they had Stanford. So therefore, we must need venture capital and we must need a Stanford to generate startups. And that's not wrong. Silicon Valley definitely had those, and those were important. But that's kind of the surface characteristics, not necessarily the causal elements underneath that made Silicon Valley what it has become over the last 30 to 40 years. The biggest source of that was federal R&D, especially military R&D, which no one in Silicon Valley wants to admit, but Lockheed and Boeing were hugely critical to the vibrancy of Silicon Valley. I mean, they're the ones who bought up all the semiconductors in the 60s and 70s. You had catalytic individuals like William Shockley and Fred Terman. But the most important element of Silicon Valley is this spin-off culture. And that's not a surprise. But the biggest reason that Silicon Valley has this spin-off culture is not because of the people, and it's not altogether because of the weather, not completely, that helps. The biggest reason is because California does not enforce non-compete agreements, and they never have. They are void and unenforceable in the state of California. And if California had even moderate enforcement of non-compete agreements, there's a good chance Silicon Valley would not have developed where it was. It would have been Colorado or Texas or other places. And that was a policy choice made by California. And does anyone want to guess when that choice was made? It was 1872. Do you know how many semiconductor companies there were in California in 1872? Not a lot. So this was not something that enlightened policymakers in the 80s or the 70s or the 90s all of a sudden said, oh my God, we have to stop enforcing non-compete agreements. It was already there. So there were all sorts of unintended choices and aspects about the policy environment that shape what became Silicon Valley. And I think that's really important even today, because we need to look, whether it's in upstate New York or in Kansas City or anywhere else, for that kind of invisible policy dimension that may be tripping up your startups, but it doesn't come to mind when you think about startups. It's not something you can put money into. It's not something you can cut with a bill, but it's out there hurting your startups. That non-compete agreement enforcement or non-enforcement in California is a really good example of that. So I think what we can learn from Silicon Valley is to look for those obstacles or those barriers to the movement of people and ideas in your upstate communities. That fluidity and that velocity of movement is what created that spin-off culture, what this fairly recent book called experimental capitalism. So what is blocking the fluidity and the velocity of people and ideas and resources in upstate communities around the country? That, I think, is the key lesson from Silicon Valley, and kind of everything else follows from there. Boulder has become kind of the new ideal of the startup community. It's a very nice place. They have characteristics that you're never going to imitate elsewhere, like mountains. I mean, upstate New York has a nice landscape too, but like Kansas City's never going to have mountains. But Boulder, even though it's kind of entered our, the public consciousness for those of us who work in the entrepreneurship world, it's only kind of entered our minds in the last few years, thanks to Brad Feld. And Brad's done a great job promoting what he calls the Boulder thesis. But we looked at some data a few years ago, and in 2010, so this is 6-year-old data by now, but in 2010, Boulder had the highest tech startup density in the country. I don't think that's surprising. What was surprising to us, at least, was that was also true in 1990. Boulder had the highest tech startup density. So this is another good example that these vibrant ecosystems have very deep roots. Boulder, too, had federal research facilities. There's a lot of national labs there. had IBM, and a lot of IBM alumni went off and started companies. They started Storage Tech. Storage Tech went public, and you had all these alumni from Storage Tech start companies in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. And it was, again, this generational or genealogical process of starting companies. Not coincidentally, Colorado also does not enforce non-compete agreements. Not a coincidence. But the other important thing about Boulder, it was also true of Silicon Valley, is that just because you have federal research money into your universities, into labs, it's not a guarantee. You've got great research facilities in upstate New York, but just the fact of their existence is not a guarantee of entrepreneurs or technology or startups coming out of them. And that's an important place to look for those barriers. And we can talk about the technology commercialization process because it's so messed up in so many places around the country. No doubt New York is not an exception to that. But just having those is not a guarantee. And actually, UC Boulder actually does not have a great reputation for being friendly to IP. So it wasn't just commercializing, it was just having people there and their ability to mix and interact and to connect with each other. It's the biggest lesson from Boulder. The third example that I think is a really good learning opportunity for not just upstate New York, for other communities, but is St. Louis. St. Louis, like a lot of other cities, has just been savaged by deindustrialization and population loss. Detroit gets all the attention for kind of urban decline and everything, but the population curve of St. Louis looks the exact same as Detroit's, just at lower magnitude because they were smaller. And this kind of culminated, you had giant companies leave St. Louis and just be abandon the city, and this kind of culminated in 2008 when Anheuser-Busch was acquired by InBev, a Belgian South American brewer, and this was like disaster for St. Louis. But that same year, in 2008, the worst of the recession was when this little organization called I-10 was founded, Information Technology Entrepreneurs Network. And it's this guy, Jim Brasunas, who started it. Jim had been a telecom entrepreneur and executive. And Jim tells the story that he was he was mentoring some entrepreneurs and he knew some investors. And he said he would go talk to the investors. And they would say, oh, there's no entrepreneurs in St. Louis. I got to fly to Silicon Valley to find them and to invest in anything. And then the next day he would go talk to the entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurs would say, oh, there's no investors in St. Louis. I got to fly to Silicon Valley to find them. So Jim said he had this vision of like a plane full of investors and entrepreneurs flying from St. Louis out to San Francisco to find each other. So he started I-10 just to connect them and then to offer very kind of basic training and services to startups, what he calls the blocking and tackling, how to pitch, how to hire, just how to move through all the very nuts and bolts stuff of starting a company. And then a few years later, this program called Arch Grants was started, which is private and public money that just goes into unrestricted small grants to startups. If you move to St. Louis or you stay in St. Louis, you get this grant. It's not the same as Startup New York. They're not getting exemption from taxes. You don't have to be at a specific address to get the designation like Startup New York. But it's been hugely catalytic, not just for the money. I mean, the money's nice, but it's not huge. We're talking 20,000, 30,000. That's really important to a startup. These are not huge equity investments. The most important thing about Arch Grants is that beyond the money, they've built a network of the companies. And it's not just tech companies. They're companies of any kind. And the companies will tell you that it's that connectivity, that network, that they can learn from their peers in the same industry, in other industries. They can find each other. They can find investors. They can find mentors. That is more important than the money. And St. Louis, kind of beyond anything you could have conceived of 8 years ago, now has this very thriving tech startup scene. And happily for a researcher, it shows up in the data where St. Louis has turned around much faster and earlier than the country as a whole in terms of business creation and growth. And things could still go wrong, but I think it's a really good example for a lot of places that don't have some of the characteristics of Silicon Valley and Boulder. There's a lot to learn, especially for a lot of Rust Belt cities across the U.S. So now I just want to highlight what I think are the key lessons from those, in addition to the ones I've already talked about, and have the most application to upstate New York. I've already talked about universities. But actually, universities, their far more important role to play is not technology commercialization. That's important. But if you want to create entrepreneurs at your universities, they need to focus on what universities do best, which is giving students experience and exposure to entrepreneurship. This does not mean sitting in a class learning how to write a business plan or how to pitch to an investor. That is not the same as experience and exposure. That's the how of entrepreneurship. That's not the what and the why of entrepreneurship. Stanford did not put generations of students through business plan writing classes to produce lots of IPOs. It taught kids engineering, and it taught them medical technology. It taught them music technology. Stanford has an unbelievable heritage of music entrepreneurs, computer science and music. And what we're learning from a lot of programs and research is that experience and exposure to entrepreneurship might be the most important thing if you want to create more entrepreneurs. There's this long-running health study in Massachusetts, the Framingham Heart Study, where they track people for like 40 or 50 years. And we've learned a lot about disease, heart disease, cancer, but we've learned a lot also about the behavioral aspects of health. And the best example is smoking. If you are friends with smokers or you know a smoker, you grew up in a house with smokers, you're more likely to be a smoker. I've got to find a better example, but it's the same as entrepreneurship. But entrepreneurship is just like smoking, just doesn't have a good ring to it. But it's actually the same thing. That if you grow up around entrepreneurs, if you move in the same circles, if you know entrepreneurs, you are much more likely to be an entrepreneur. So that experience and exposure is a huge thing that universities can do. Peer learning, that's what universities are all about. And as I hope all the entrepreneurs in the room can attest, that interaction with peers is often the most valuable thing they get from programs. In surveys of accelerators and incubators, this is what the entrepreneurs will tell you. It's nice to have access to the money. It's good to have access to the investors and the mentors, but the number one reason they wanted to go or get into that program was to connect with other entrepreneurs and to learn from their peers. Different industries, same industries, doesn't matter. I've already talked about the teaching kids something. It's just teach them something, the what and the why, and then they'll go out and solve problems. They can pick up the business plan writing skills later. Teach them about something that they can then apply to solving a problem as an entrepreneur. I've already talked about connectivity, so I won't dwell on it, but this is really, really important. This is what all your programs do. You can see entrepreneurship kind of cascading through the generations, and you can see how entrepreneurship just propagates itself through relationships, mentors, advisors, co-workers, former employees. A couple of those network maps on the right are from Endeavor Insight, and I think Marnie's here from Launch New York. She was going to be here. Oh, hey. But Endeavor is mapping Syracuse and Buffalo, is that right? So you'll have similar maps for Rochester, I'm sorry. You'll have similar maps for those two cities to be able to actually see and visualize the connections and where the holes are in terms of your entrepreneurial ecosystem in those cities. And this is something we're trying to work with Endeavor and others to do for everyone. I think every city should have kind of a dynamic network map in that where you can see everything in real time and see how it's developing or how it's not developing. A third element is immigrants. Immigrant Americans are twice as likely to start a company than native-born Americans. And if you don't have a high percentage of immigrants in your community, you're going to underperform in terms of entrepreneurship. Brian already talked about diversity, and this is one element of diversity in a lot of programs. Upstate New York has a lot of room to grow in terms of immigrant populations. And with the exception of Ithaca, because of Cornell, a lot of your communities are far below the national average, which is about 13% in terms of immigration. I inadvertently left Syracuse off this list. Syracuse is about 5.5%, so Syracuse is like stuck in the 1970s. Probably in more ways than one, but immigrants are really important to your community. They're going to not only start their own companies, they're going to catalyze a whole lot of other activity, and they're going to create jobs for everyone. Your universities are a huge magnet in doing that, clearly, as with Cornell in Ithaca. And then finally, this cannot be all about your tech entrepreneurs. Those are really important. But if you look at some of the examples I talked about earlier, Boulder, some of the biggest entrepreneurial successes coming out of Boulder were food. Chipotle and Noodles and Company, those are not tech companies. They use tech. But you have a huge food entrepreneurship scene in places like Boulder. Up on the slide before with St. Louis, I had beer. Craft beer is like one of, as you know, across New York, I mean, it's one of the two greatest entrepreneurial stories in this country over the last 10 to 15 years. And that is like the least sexy thing. It's become sexy now, but at the beginning it totally wasn't. And in St. Louis, dominated by Anheuser-Busch, and since the acquisition, you've seen just this explosion of craft beer in St. Louis. And that was not on the radar at all. That's one of the other important things about St. Louis is that the IT scene, the IT entrepreneurship scene, and the beer scene were almost completely ignored by civic leaders. For about the last 20 years, all the attention and the resources in St. Louis have gone into biotech. And there's good stuff going on in biotech in St. Louis. I don't know what's going to happen now that Monsanto is merging with Bayer. But there's a lot. All the resources in St. Louis are going into biotech. They've created strategic plans for the city, and all the civic leaders were all about biotech. And then when no one was looking, IT exploded, and then beer exploded, and had almost no support from civic leadership until it became too hard for them to ignore. And that's actually a common story across a lot of other places. I've heard that the same is true in Vancouver, where all the leadership and all the attention was going into clean energy and clean tech. Again, important, but without anybody looking, this huge entrepreneurship scene in athletic apparel led by Lululemon just exploded. And when no one was looking, it got almost no resources or attention. So don't forget what this guy, Reed Bowles, Reed runs a barge company, probably like the least sexy company ever, and he runs a smoothie company too. But what Reed calls your scruffy or your grungy entrepreneurs, they're really important for the dynamism of your ecosystem and for jobs. And you're going to get growth companies out of your scruffy and grungy entrepreneurs too. So just to end, because I'm probably way over time, but I think what you can learn from these places and from other places, not just these three, there's a difference in your approach to your ecosystem. You can take a blueprint approach or you can take a recipe approach. And Brian actually had a really good phrase for the blueprint approach when he mentioned the startup city monoculture. That's what most places do. They treat it like a blueprint where you can have all these elements perfectly arranged. You know how they're going to fit. You know what it's going to look like. They all have their place. If we have this many accelerators or this many funds or this many competitions, it's going to look like this. And that's not how entrepreneurship is at all. And that's not how ecosystems develop or become vibrant. It's much more like a recipe where you can have the same ingredients, research universities, immigrants, connective programs, but that recipe is going to be different every time. And it's going to look different in every place because the way those ingredients come together is going to depend on the place. So you've got to figure out what the right recipe is for your place. You can learn from other places, but to just copy everything is not going to get you what you want. There's this phrase making its way around entrepreneurship circles that you can have this ecosystem in a box. And I wish I had made that up because it's almost like it's this great self-parody of that blueprint or that monocultural approach. But this is like if you go pay a consultant, they're going to come to you with a report for an ecosystem in a box. And that's the opposite of entrepreneurship, and that's the opposite of the approach you want to take. So I think Upstate New York has a lot to learn from these communities, but it's about finding that recipe, even if you have the same ingredients. What's the right recipe for your upstate communities? But just based on what Martin and Brian have said and what's going to be said later, I mean, clearly there's a lot going on. You guys are on your way. So I really look forward to learning more and to figuring out how Kauffman can help you. So thank you.